Okay, so for today, we're going to do a kind of a mixture of different topics. I was thinking I would start off by talking about org trinitarianism, the overall project, and we used the STP diagrams in Figma that we had talked about in the previous meetings, kind of laying out like this is what we are working on right now, right, in diagrammatic form, and how we're trying to answer certain questions, right? Like how exactly to make sense of these diagrams, action, constraint, reduction arrows, and this monster diagram. All those things, they're very interesting and they've been very useful for us because we can kind of align our research using them, right? So we don't have at STP, we don't force like a specific line of research. One of the best things is that we enable like kind of you to go in any direction that you're interested in, but then we have kind of these stepping stones or these markers to align ourselves along a common direction. So that's kind of how I see like the monster diagram. Right. A lot of our projects can fit under one or a hybrid of these modes. We don't have to like tackle all of the things at the same time, but it's good every once in a while, like with the paper that we recently submitted, to be able to take a step back and say like, what is the overall, where's the overall research going, and like what are the open problems that we all share using this formalism. So in that spirit, I have added all of the categorical machinery that or the math machinery that we've talked about in the past, and I've grouped them into these three parts of the triad, right, of the org triad. So when someone comes to us and says like, what do you mean by organization? What is an organization? We always have like three answers to give, right? We say like, well, organization is how it's composed. It's what it can see about the world, what it can perceive, and it's how it interacts with other forms of organization. So really, the answer to what is an organization is always like a little bit complicated. And the nice thing about this recent movement in applied category theory that we've been really benefiting a lot, right? There's like a pipeline from the Topos Institute to our group in a lot of ways, because we kind of just borrow a lot from them. But the nice thing about the ACT wave that's happening is that it gives us the tools to make very precise statements about these three parts of the definition of an organization. So let me zoom in, and then once I present this, we can then move on to ologs, which is one part of this. I put it in the intelligibility box, but it may actually belong to more than one box. I'm not sure. So then, yeah, I'll talk about ologs with John, and then at the end, John is going to present some stuff on cooperatives, because we think that one of the most exciting applications of this framework we're developing is that we can start to actually like help organizations connect to one another, and to create kind of a virtuous cycle of cooperatives, aiding one another, funding one another, providing resources. So yeah, I think that would be a really interesting discussion to kind of concretely apply this formalism. So let me see if I can zoom in. And so for composition, right, in the primer, in the later chapters, we use this notion of the operad. This is also based on a paper that Spivak wrote on wiring diagrams, but also other people in ACT have tried to use category theory to describe resource theories. So how resources kind of move and get copied or reused along different paths. And the whole idea of the operad is that you have a box with wires, and then if you unbox this, you get another set of boxes, and then you can do that procedure as much as you want, right? Every box is another set of boxes. And I've written here like types and drew these red dotted arrows to show that at the joints of these boxes, right, where the boxes kind of connect up to each other, we can add extra information for the allowable inputs and outputs of that box. And this is all in the Spivak paper. You basically define a process, and then you say, okay, these are the inputs to the process, and this is the output. And then that basically defines a constraint that it must apply at all scales, right? Some set of constraints at a higher scale must eventually be respected at the lower scale. Although, like I might define the types of this outer box as being one thing, but then the inner boxes, as long as they end up matching, you'll satisfy those constraints. Also stop me if I'm going too fast, but yeah, that's basically operads, right? And then we made this insight in the primer that this formalism was especially suited for describing how capital works, basically how like production processes work in not all forms of capitalism, but industrial forms specifically, where you take some materials and labor and you can produce a product from it. And then we can actually define like capital itself as a constraint on these boxes, right? Namely that the value of the output must be greater than the value of the input. So then you can generate surplus value. So that would be like a type level constraint that then propagates downward into the smaller boxes. So this is composition, right? Like composition means how are things made up of other things, and how do those smaller parts relate to the larger part? The thing on the right here, the multiplicity principle, it throws like a wrench into things, because it says that when you build up a process from smaller processes, you can start to get generative or irreducible effects to appear. So in MES language, you have these things called degenerate objects that can be decomposed into two different patterns that are not, these two patterns are not themselves related. And when you have a complex link, which is a link that can be factored through a degenerate object, you basically have a link that cannot be broken down into smaller clusters, right? Cannot be, there's some extra information in this complex link that's not in the its constituents. Yeah, so that throws a wrench into things, because in the operad picture, it's like you have these boxes, and then you can build more boxes out of those smaller boxes, and it just seems like a very transitive process, right? But the multiplicity principle, if you were to throw that in, you would start to see like there's some things in the upper level boxes that cannot be explained by just looking at the lower level boxes, essentially, and that's important. Here I've also drawn types to go to these circles. So these circles can also be conceived of as types of things, right? So people, commodities, but whatever, that can be considered a type. And then with configuration categories, that's also from MES. This is the idea that like we can describe using the links between types or between objects in some category. We can describe a lot of different systems. The MES stuff is nice because it's like a very stripped down version. Like it's really early in the applied category theory literature, like in terms of it's not super sophisticated yet, and how modern, I guess, applied category theory is. But it tackles a very concrete problem, which is how to represent dynamics between systems, or dynamics of a system over time. So that you get a lot of interesting things like being able to break a single colimit down to its underlying patterns, and then they call that a ramification. But basically, the ramification in MES is much like the operad in above, right, where you unbox things. But yeah, the nice point in MES is that, okay, you can't always do this because of the multiplicity principle, that eventually as you unbox things, you run into these degenerate objects. That's their notion of complexity. Okay, so then these three things are kind of the core of what I would say our idea of composition is. Like, if you really wanted to make precise statements about composition, you would use something something like this, right? As of right now.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, I just wanted, so how close to the notion of, like, how close to an atom is, once you find like such a thing that cannot be decomposed? Because it seems to be like a sort of like negative definition of atom, in the sense that it's irreducible, so you cannot go to a finer scale without losing relevant information, while the like the atom in Badiou is also like has a synthetic power, right? It's also able to reconstruct stuff that is sort of relevant to the whole. Does it also has an implication on that part, or is it more about not being able to sort of like go down?
Yeah, it's an interesting point. I think the atom, there is a relation between the atom and the irreducible or the degenerate object. But I would say, whereas the atom prescribes the ultimate limit of decomposition, right? It's like you cannot go further. The degenerate object is just it's just a warning saying, yes, you could decompose this further, but you're going to lose some of the effects of the explanatory power. Like going from an orange to the atoms of the orange, you may lose things like flavor, texture, its growth cycles, all that stuff. Like you may understand, it may be correct to go to the atomic level of an orange if you want to understand the way that these particles are interacting, how like at the molecular atomic level, but then you don't get those emergent effects once all those atoms were put together at the scale of an orange, basically. So the atom you choose is dependent on what's useful as a model. The degenerate object is more like an obstacle to explanation of certain features.
I think one analogy that comes to my mind is like in consciousness research. Like there's on one hand you have to explain. I mean, what actually the second thing is more famous. Like people often ask like how like the binding of multiple sort of percepts is possible. So how from like local processes of information, like say you have like colors and sounds, how is it possible that you can compose into a sort of like synthetic unified picture? But there's also like this other question that I think is like the complement, which I think apparently this degenerate object sort of helps to answer, which is like, for example, why qualities such as like color appear as sort of like the simple qualitative things, right? So in a sense, you could explain that in terms of it being, in some sense, non-decomposable, but it's still like a different problem, which is one thing is how colors can sort of like bind into like a complex experience, and the other thing is why colors appear as simple things. Maybe it's a knowledge that came to my mind.
Yeah, that's a good one. Yeah, I think I think the principle we're following is that in phenomenology we accept the existence or the being of appearances, right? That all appearances have some kind of ontological value. And then the question is how these different ontological units connect together. It may not be like, how do you say, like putting two things together doesn't necessarily equal something that can be decomposed back down to the original beings. So yeah, I don't know. I think the text that we talked about, the Ellie Adam one, that's a really important to make a further advance in this, to understand the multiplicity principle. And this is what I drew here as this Penrose triangle, because with that text, the idea is that you can characterize the obstacle to reducibility using this technique in mathematics called cohomology, which basically tells you like how much of an obstacle there is to reducing something back down to its parts. So it's not simply is it degenerate or is it not degenerate, but rather there is a measure of degeneracy. And then that text is really good because it applies to all sorts of different phenomena, this technique. But if you imagine just like as an intuition for this, let me zoom in. You know, like the whole thing of the Penrose triangle is that it looks like an impossible object, even though it's clearly not impossible to draw. And so like to explain it, you can assign to every point in this object a distance to your eye, right? And then if you were to do that separately, like let's say, let me just put this here and then do like no fill, right? If you're just looking inside this purple circle here and you were to do this, you could say, for example, like as you go up on this triangle, it's moving further away from your eye, right? And maybe this horizontal line, it's staying even with your eye. Okay, and that's fine. And then you have a certain number, right, that defines how far away it is. You do the same for the top and then the same for the left. And then you find out that these numbers don't add up, right? That you can't glue these three assignments of numbers together. Right? In other words, it like cannot be a sheaf. But this this basic thing, cohomology tells us like, okay, if we have this assignment and it doesn't add up, we can characterize how much it doesn't add up. In what sense? So like there's different classes of cohomology that you can describe. So I think, yeah, there's something here that we need to understand, like how cohomology works, and then how it can be maybe even formalized in computers, because there's a way to linearize this that it defines in Ellie Adam defines in his text. Okay, hopefully that was not too much of a detour. Yeah, so anyway, we have this idea of composition. We can glue things together to produce other things, but then, you know, generativity happens, and we cannot reduce things back down. And then the last piece of this was the Mariology text, also by Spivak and others. And I think David Jas Myers also and Brendan Fong were co-authors there. And I think the idea here is that given a object that is composite, that's made up of other objects, we can take constraints from one part of that object and pass them along to other parts of the object. So the basic example is if you're dancing, your feet, what you do with your arms must match what you do with your feet, right? Otherwise it wouldn't look like a dance. So you would be passing, like, depending on what you're doing, the type of movement in your feet would pass certain constraints onto what you're allowed to do with your hand, while still remaining, within the confines of the, like, let's say the dance, something that could still be conceived as dancing. So I think this is a nice way because it also applies to things that don't necessarily have like a physical connection with one another. So what we were interested in is the way that different organizations may form a body without necessarily having like some kind of subset relation to one another. Like, how do you align different movements or different groups of people together in such a way that they operate like a body without what is the minimum requirements for that to happen, right? I think that's something along the lines of what this Mariology stuff gives us, is that we don't have to know ahead of time how these boxes, where these boxes come from. They could be logically related rather than like physically a part of the larger box. Yeah, so that's composition, some ideas there. Then inside of intelligibility, we have 3 ideas. One is the categorical databases on ologs, which we're about to present. I'll skip that for now. And then with sheaves, we have this idea of gluing information together. So it's pretty straightforward. It's basically this map that obeys some constraints such that we can zoom in and out and get a consistent set of data corresponding to some phenomena, right? So like this text that I wrote, which got me interested in this topic, which tried to model, I tried to model like the market as a sheaf or a process of sheafification. So you have like all these commodities out there and then you assign prices to them, but in the way that we interact in the market, those prices have to obey certain constraints, right? For one, they cannot allow for arbitrage, which is when you just like buy something over here and then sell it over there at a higher price, right? That's not allowed in a consistent market. So this constraint forces the prices to kind of adjust over time, and general equilibria theory or kind of neoliberal ideology basically says like over time the market's going to come up with one set of prices that's like the optimum set, right, based on everyone's supply and demand and the individual preferences of each person. You can kind of come up with this optimal pricing scheme. And then the idea is, okay, but what if in that process there are certain topological things like this Penrose triangle, something emerges at higher levels that you did not see when you just had individuals trading. If you have like this cohomological properties, you may not get a sheaf at the end, right? It may be, and that's one example of like how you could apply sheaves to the information of the market to describe capitalist crises, for example. So that's interesting, right? It can be helpful. And I think in general, like any phenomena that is made up of multiple parts, right, can be described this way. So when we ask like what does an organization sense about its environment, we can start with some large scale phenomena and break them down into smaller things, right? Include them together again. So yeah, it's actually related also to the ologs thing. We'll talk about it. Ologs give us kind of a very concrete way to manipulate the different parts. What are these little boxes here that get glued together, right? The third thing in intelligibility has to do with memory. So not only do we perceive things, or not only do organizations have some kind of sensible data coming in, they also store that in the form of artifacts of some kind. So in a company, that might be just like paperwork, or in computers now, digital databases. Actually, we use our phones in this way, but also your culture, your family history, all those things are stored somewhere, right? That's in concrete objects. And in MES literature, the role of memory is to kind of be the refresher of your landscape. So at every instant, whatever that instant is, the duration is not doesn't need to be defined, but whatever, at every instant, you're kind of creating your landscape again from the memory, right? And it becomes really interesting when we start talking about more distributed forms of cognition, like a police department. We use that example a lot. Like, how does a police department see the world? Well, it has police records. It has body cam footage. It has witness testimonies. Like all these things that are stored somewhere, and then the landscape itself is like kind of this ephemeral thing that has to be reconstructed. And if you destroy parts of the memory, then you can't reconstruct that landscape anymore. So yeah, that's also interesting. And it again relates to ologs, because ologs are a type of record, or a way to think about records in memory. One other thing about memory that I think is interesting is that it itself is an evolutive system. So memory can become more complex over time. If we go to the left here, the complexification process is when you have like a pattern, and then you find a colimit that binds that pattern together, right? But those objects that become the binding agents for a lower level pattern, they themselves can form patterns at a higher level, and then they can be bound again, right? So you have this hierarchical category setups, and the same thing applies to memory. So you have like simple memories, maybe like sensations that you physically may remember, but then that can be bound together by like a story, or like a specific like episode of your memory, and then that can be bound up further into like kind of your life history. And then beyond the individual, you have the history of a community, of a city, of a nation, and so on, right? So it has those same compositional properties. And then in interaction, we have so a lot of interesting stuff here. So we haven't talked about this in a long time, but with lenses, we have this ability to describe a forward and a backwards arrow model of interacting with your environment. So if you think, basically the forward is like sending out if it was like a game theoretical setup, you would be sending out your play, right? Your strategy, how you want to respond to something. And then the backwards arrow would be kind of like your feedback from the environment in the form of, in open games, it's called your co-play function, but it's basically like how you would assign rewards to your actions, right? And then this vertical arrow that goes from the top green box to the bottom one is called the residual, and that's kind of your state. So how you, much like a landscape, how you perceive the current state of the game, and then you take the input from the external world, and then you can like record something, so you can modify your strategy over time. So then there's a lot of interesting literature I'm not an expert in. I just I'm giving you like the very 8-bit version, but there's a connection between this form of interaction and learning in general. The idea is that we can model learning on this basic flow of like, throw something out there into the environment, see what comes back, and then modify your internal state so that you can send something else out. So it's a very powerful idea, I think. And then we, in memory evolutive systems, we made this distinction between the world, the environment, and the landscape. We can make that more precise too by talking about the environment as itself another open game, right, or lens itself. And this creates this fundamental ambiguity between what is the environment and what is the landscape, right, or what is the thing acting on the environment. It may be possible that from one perspective something is an environment, and the other thing is the player or the actor in the environment. But you can switch to another perspective where the environment is now the player within some other environment. So I think that we should definitely revisit that, because it kind of shows us like the malleability of this distinction, right? And worlds are just kind of this like way that these different environments connect together. I think that's also like an open question of how we want to model this. I think last time we talked about like the difference between truth and verification, and or truth, validity, and trust, something like that, right? Like, I think that plays into this.
It was fidelity, trust, and validity.
Okay, nice. Yeah, exactly. Like fidelity seems to be like some relation to the world, right? But validity and trust have to do more with like who's the player and who's the environment. Yeah, but I think there's some connection there that I think we should revisit. What else? So we have, this is another model of interaction, and then admissible procedures. That's also useful. Basically, if you'll notice, like MES is in all three of these boxes, because I think MES is kind of like the blueprint for the type of formalism we want. But the nice thing about it is you can kind of swap out different parts of this. Like if this is the car, we can swap out the engine, right? The engine of interaction, for example, we can use how MES describes it with this, which is this interaction between co-regulators and effectors, but we can also replace it with like lenses and optics, and the whole MES car will still run. So in the case of the native implementation, let's say, of interaction in MES, we have this idea of admissible procedures, which are once the co-regulator talks to the memory and reconstructs this landscape, which is its internal model of the world, the co-regulator can then send out it can choose from a set of procedures to send to the effector, or the effector would be something that can change the state of the whole evolutive system. So the co-regulator would, choose from the set of allowable procedures, and then from the feedback of that, it can modify this set, right? Because we want to be able to say, like, the set of admissible procedures is not a static thing. I mean, it is if you're a thermostat, you can only ever, for example, turn on or turn off the heater, for example. But for more complicated systems, we want to be able to add and remove procedures. We want to be able to experiment and learn about the environment, so that the set of procedures that we have becomes better over time. So I think that's where this notion of admissible procedures is useful, to kind of model how that set is changing. Another idea here, I put it here, but we've really never talked about it, but this is like the latest stuff coming out of the applied category theory, like Topos gang, which is this notion of dynamical operads. So we take the notion of operads from over here, but now we add in some extra information that describes how to rewire things within the boxes. So it's not only this wiring, but a whole set or whole space of different wirings allowed. And then those wirings can change depending on certain conditions. That's how I understand this. So with that, we have this more, again, a more interactive definition of things. Depending on what inputs I get, I may want to rewire myself to be able to interact differently. Yeah, so yeah, dynamical operads, definitely we should look into that. I think that's seems very promising. And then this last thing is the we presented on temporal type theory or behavior sheaves, and this is relating the sheaves from the previous from intelligibility, but now imagine that the base space of this is time, and that the objects themselves are certain behaviors that are occurring in time. So you get all of the rigorous gluing, the rigorous account of gluing. You can still import that here. So you can take two behaviors and glue them together to form a composite behavior. You can take a complex behavior and break it down into smaller behaviors, right? And this seems useful too, as an organization starts to learn about its environment. It cannot simply act on the behaviors that it perceives, but it must do some internal decomposition, which I'm not sure what to call that yet, but something must be happening for an organization to break down complex behavior into smaller pieces of behavior so that it can learn how to modify the composite behavior later on. If that makes sense, right? You want to change, you want to stop climate change, right? That the composite behavior is that the climate is warming, but that's useless in itself. You cannot just from that know what to do. So you have to decompose that behavior of warming to smaller behaviors, like the behavior of acidification of the ocean, behavior of the emissions of greenhouse gases, and so on, right? That I think that's where we kind of get a useful, we kind of really get the usefulness of this idea. And because it's based on the base space is time, we're able to take a lot of we're able to create a lot of operators that obey temporal constraints. I mean, the simplest one is these two behaviors have to be overlapping in order to be glued together, right? Or they must agree on their overlap in some way. Okay, so yeah, that was a much longer intro than I originally wanted, but yeah, that's basically where we're at in terms of all of the different categorical technologies that we've been bringing in. So now I wanted to
But
focus.
that said, I just want to throw down that like
Yeah,
we got to the point theoretically that you've been able to summarize in 45 minutes, like tens of hours of presentations. Like
yes,
this is a product of several years now of synthesis and condensation. So it's pretty dope.
yeah, it's amazing. I mean, I think the MES stuff is really good there because it kind of creates this vehicle for kind of jumping between these different formalisms. Like we knew when we were talking about these originally, we knew like, okay, this is important for this type of problem. Like operats, they're really cool if you want to describe like how to break down a production process into like all the way down to like labor and raw materials. But we didn't know how that fit in with everything else that we were talking about. So I think MES is nice because it lets you kind of see how it all fits together. Sorry, can you guys still hear me? I don't know if I'm
Yeah.
cut out for a second.
Yeah, you're good. As far as I can tell.
Okay. Yeah, and then yeah, so as we're going, I would suggest like you don't need to worry too much about the technical details of each one of these. Obviously, if you have the time and you care about it, you should go read about it and like we can talk about the technical details. But I think right now it's just nice to be able to take a step back and say like, okay, this is where this formalism fits in this overall project that we're doing. And then like it basically says like this is the right tool for the job if you want to answer a question about intelligibility, for example. And then you can start from there. So like if you have a question about something about organization, we can basically say like, hey, if you're interested in this part about organization, go here and learn about this. And maybe you can apply this tool to the problem. That's how I think of about this these categories. So in the presentation on ologs, yeah, let's go to this. I have written a 1-slide summary because I didn't have the time or really the understanding of the whole paper to be able to come up with like a fully fleshed out thing. But I wrote down what John and I understood about how ologs work. So ologs are basically a categorical description of knowledge, right? How you would represent knowledge in a category. And it leverages compositionality of types, what they call types and aspects, but basically the compositionality of knowledge so that you can take small bits of knowledge and stitch them together with other bits of knowledge to form larger bits of knowledge, right? And this, again, with the MES framework, that is perfect because the idea of memory as a compositional thing, as something that's like built up from smaller fragments of memory, that's exactly what ologs do. And it's done in a very rigorous way, to the point where you can basically simulate any kind of database using this, right? This is I would say the essence of databases that might be on any computer or any server that we interact with on a regular basis. It can be formalized in this way, and when you do formalize it in this way, you get a lot of cool properties that normal databases don't have inherently. So let's talk about the details of that. So let's start off with what an olog is. An olog is a pair of things. It's two things, right? It's a graph and it's some facts that live or can be expressed by this graph. So I didn't write it down, but a graph is basically a set of nodes and edges, right? Or vertices and edges. The edges are the arrows, vertices are the boxes in this case. They're a fact can be expressed as a commutative diagram. So what is commutativity? That's an extra thing. Graphs don't necessarily have to be commutative in the sense that if I have an arrow or an edge from A to B and an arrow from B to C, in a normal graph doesn't need to be a graph from A to C. But in a category that is true, right? In a category, you have basically a completion of a graph so that all the transitivity holds for paths. So yeah, there will be some playing around with this difference between graph and category. That's kind of where the interesting stuff happens in the olog. So yeah, in the terminology, the underlying graph to the olog is called its language. And you can basically think of facts as sentences that you can write with the language. The same way you have like a vocabulary, and then you have like sentences you can build from the vocabulary. Facts are built from the underlying graph. The facts of an olog are a subset of possible assertions that you can make in the language. So yeah, you can have like I can give you a set of commutative diagrams. Let's say I give you 5 commutative diagrams, such as this one here about the pentanol. And that might be only a subset of what you can say about the pentanol or about in that language of the underlying graph. So there's that distinction, right? Like facts don't exhaust the olog. They're just subsets of what you can say. And then given a set of facts, I can order them by inclusion. So I can say like a set A of facts includes a set B of facts if the set A of facts, has all the same facts as B, but maybe has some extra ones.
Yeah, I haven't finished, but I mean, in the simplest form, I remember that a fact is also just like some commutative diagram, right? So if, for example, here the equivalence between saying like that the pentanol is a tropical wetland and a floodplain. No, I mean, it's maybe not a good example, but the fact that a tropical wetland is a place and also a floodplain is a place, the fact that you can go from a tropical wetland and a floodplain to the place through different ways, and
exactly.
the connection between these two paths and they having some form of equivalence is a fact in the basic, most simplest way, right?
Yes. Yeah. I should have mentioned this too. Yeah. Commutative means that all paths are equivalent. So you can see that there's like at least 3 different paths to a place, right? So pentanol is tropical wetland and a floodplain, which is a place. But you can also go, the pentanol is a tropical wetland and a floodplain, and you can go to a floodplain, which is just a decomposition of that composite type, and then go to a place. Or you can do through the tropical wetland. And all 3 of those paths are equivalent in some sense, because what they mean in the end is that the pentanol is a place. Right? So it's like 3 different senses in which the pentanol is a place. It is a place because it is a tropical wetland and a floodplain. It is a place because it is a floodplain, and it is a place because it's a tropical wetland. It's kind of basic in that sense. It doesn't really, it almost mirrors like a computer's understanding of things. And that's kind of the point, is that if you describe these types in a very like rigorous way, it's going to resemble closer and closer to like how a database would work to record information about this.
Right, but you could have non-trivial sort of like facts, right? Like, I don't know, like they different ways in which you can verify that, I don't know, like the DNA, like some protein, you could like figure out its mass in different ways, and then the fact that they are both describing something about like a physical property through two different instruments, you could maybe Like the fact that these two paths towards this property are the same is telling something about the invariance under these two paths, right? So
Yes.
that's
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point. Yeah.
Mhm.
So you can start off with very basic facts and then start to glue them together, I think. Because like if we think about it from a practical standpoint, we don't have access to the graph G yet. Sometimes we just have facts. We just have some facts and we want to write an olog. We want to produce an olog. So we don't have one yet. Therefore, we're taking these facts and we're trying to see how they can be arranged together. And that process is, I think, close to what you're saying about like finding invariances. Like we don't know what a place is, but we may start out with the idea that every place has an area, has an like area in the sense of like a size, right?
I think it's also in here, like with this example, the arrows are essentially equality arrows, but we can use looser things like isomorphisms and whatnot, which is where I think your point would really come in, Renzo, where, you know, two different measurings might not technically be identical, but from like a certain perspective, they're isomorphic in terms of like they're ultimately measuring the same kind of object. So as we kind of zoom out and reconfigure, we get to be able to play with some of these looser ideas of sameness that the last 100 years of math have given us.
Mhm.
Is this a good place to kind of switch gears, Dennis, you think? Are there any main big ideas you want to wrap up on, or
Yeah, I was gonna just spend like another 10 minutes talking about the slide, and
Perfect.
if there's any questions.
Yeah.
Let's see what else. Yeah, so the arrows are called aspects. I think this example is kind of probably not the best one. I think there's a lot of good examples in the text itself, but you can see one non-trivial aspect would be like has an area the size of, right? A place has a certain property called its size, and that can be modeled as an arrow. The is relationship is just like a really basic type of aspect, right? One rule, as I was thinking about how to write an olog, the rule that seems to be most important is that every type must be able to have multiple instances, one or more instances of that thing. So in the case of the Pantanal itself, it's just one thing. So you could say it's like a singleton type. But for example, a tropical wetland and a floodplain, you can actually have many instances of that, right? There are many places that can be both. And there are many floodplains, there are many tropical wetlands. So if you imagine like sitting over every type is like a set of things that would fit under that type, that would be the starting point for like writing these out. And then the second thing you have to obey is the commutativity relation of paths must be the same. It must be valid no matter what path you take. Yeah, but there's some nuances that in the text they talk about, like the one between functional and non-functional relationships. But yeah, so I wanted to talk specifically about the situation where you have multiple ologs that may or may not have the same underlying graph. So we said before that the graph is like your language, right? If you imagine two different people, they have two different languages for describing things, then there ought to be a way to kind of map between the set of facts that I have and the set of facts you have, right? That would be basically the core, the big idea of this paper is that you can do that. Actually, I put that in big idea number 2, which is you can define something called a translation arrow, which is a graph homomorphism. So it maps my graph or my language to your graph or language in such a way that entailment of facts is preserved. So an entailment of a fact is like, because the Pantanal is a tropical wetland and a floodplain, the Pantanal is also a place. right? That would be like one fact entailing another, because tropical wetland and floodplain is a place. So when you do a graph homomorphism by itself, you may not preserve that structure. So that's why in the big idea number 2, in order to have a translation arrow, you must be both a homomorphism. You must both preserve the structure of the graph, but you must also preserve the entailment of the facts. Yeah, but then you can also forget, if you want to forget all the facts and just stick to the graphs, you can apply a forgetful functor that takes this category of ologs and maps them down to just their underlying graphs. So it's like basically this olog is like an extra structure on top of the category of graphs. Yeah, let's go back to big idea number 1 is if you have a set of facts, it specifies a graph. It's called in the text, it's called a G specification. So let's say I don't know what my graph is yet, but I know a set of facts. Well, from that set of facts, I can create a graph. But then from the graph, we can do something called creating a transitive closure or completion of the graph. So basically, anytime you see an arrow from A to B and an arrow from B to C, you draw in the arrow from A to C. Therefore, you complete the composition. If you do this, if you basically create the compositional arrows, you add them in, you create what's called a closed G specification, which is the set of all the regular facts that you started with plus all the entailed facts. So you can actually like generate new facts from a smaller set. And so that adds like more structure onto this olog. So you get this because of the structure of the olog, basically. And then the big idea number 3 is that an olog can be contracted, so you can delete some facts. You can expand it by adding new facts. You can revise by basically like swapping out some facts for other facts. And then you can translate them, like you're saying, take an olog from one language and translate it to an olog in another language. And then really interesting here is the idea of a common ground olog. So if there's 2 organizations that have their own landscape, they have their own like understanding of the world, we can model that as them having 2 different graphs. And 2 different ologs built on top of those graphs. So the common ground olog is kind of like the minimum olog that they can agree upon. And that's useful because if you want to teach, if one organization wants to teach the other one some new concepts, they can start from the common ground olog and then build on top of it. So maybe there's a set of facts and a set of words, let's say, or types that we can both agree on, and starting from that, we can slowly extend that knowledge. So you can start to teach the other person of new concepts, right? Yeah, I think that's really the main things I wanted to cover. But are there any questions?
Yeah, could you just comment just a bit on what a system information system is?
Yes. I think in the text, an information system is just it's a category where you have different ologs that each have their own language. So they're heterogeneous ologs. I was a bit confused by this actually, because on one part of the text, they call it an information system, and another part they call it spec. the category of heterogeneous ologs that was described in the second blue box. But basically, the interesting stuff happens when you put different ologs together, right? And the different ologs may not share the same language. So then you need to define the translation arrows between these different ologs. So if the translation arrows can compose, like if I map olog A to olog B and I can map olog B to olog C, then I should be able to map olog A to olog C.
And is this matching like type sensitive? Like if I would just like find an olog with the same sort of graph, like, but it's talking about something completely differently, like it doesn't mean that they are sharing anything. They're just like, so would you have to do some like type checking to say like, okay, there's the similar graph and they're both talking about like, I don't know, like how do you say, like faunas. So
Mhm.
they're one's talking about wetlands and the other one's talking about like tropical. No, yeah, or like tundras. And so is there like type checking that has to be done to compare, or is it just a more purely like
Yeah.
structural thing?
No, so there's no additional type checking. It's done through the set of facts that so the set of all commutative diagrams, that's some information, right? Like every commutative diagram adds a bit of extra information on top of the graph. So it's not just that okay, I map one graph to another and therefore I have a translation. No, it's that the set of facts and how they entail one another must be preserved. So in this case, the Pantanal is a place because it is a floodplain, or the fact that the Pantanal is a floodplain entails that it is a place. When I map this, olog to another olog, I have to preserve the fact that the Pantanal is a place because it is a floodplain, even if I change the names of those things. So let's say someone else calls it something else, doesn't call it the Pantanal, they call it something else. Okay, that's fine, because that you can just translate to that, whatever that type is. And maybe they have a different word for floodplain and they have a different word for place as well. That terminology can change, but the entailment structure must be there. But that does create like opportunities for like metaphorical thinking, right? Because is the Pantanal a place because it's a floodplain? Is that the same as saying like an apple is a fruit because it is, has seeds? You know what I mean? Does the entailment in one olog, how much does it determine in the other olog? I think that's an interesting question. I think the more the olog is fleshed out, like the more stuff we have in this graph, the more specific the translations have to be, because it has to account for more facts, right? If you only give me a couple of facts, then I can translate this olog to any other olog pretty easily, and there may be like a very like loose metaphorical thing going on. But if you give me something that's like everything you know about floodplains, then I can't really map that easily to some other thing, right? Without preserving a lot of structure. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
But I think that's a really good point. Like the set of facts determines the structure. So if we have to really understand how those facts like entail one another in order to really understand how to construct the translations. Yeah, so I'll do like a quick make a quick comment here, which is like, okay, this paper was written primarily as a way to apply category theory to databases. So databases store data for all sorts of organizations, they're digitized representations of knowledge. And this categorical database framework allows us to unify all the different databases out there. Like every database can basically be formalized using this scheme. And that, when talking to John, we thought, hey, this is a really good opportunity to make like a concrete application of the things we've been studying, right? Like when we talk about intelligibility or shared intelligibility between different organizations, that seems to lend itself to some type of tool or piece of software that could like be a shared communication channel. Because if you imagine like every organization has its own olog implicitly, maybe, but it's there, right? Then there's something has to be done to create translations in order for two organizations to talk to one another. So anyway, I think that's what led to this other discussion about cooperatives. So I'll switch it over to John.
Sweet. That was awesome, Dennis. First off, we got a lot of ground covered there. So hold up, I'm gonna do the thing quick. Share. All right, can everyone see my screen?
Yes.
Cool.
Yeah.
I could just I'm at war with Figma, so if I look like an idiot using it's because I am. The interface and I are not getting along, but we're gonna try it. So yeah, real like I think the really interesting thing that kind of got us going with ologs, as Dennis was saying, is that they're kind of at this weird interface where they really kind of capture a lot of the best parts of applied category theory that we've been digging into. And I think Renzo's question really hit the nail on the head. It's interesting because there really isn't like explicit place for types per se in olog, but in a weird kind of way, what you're trying to do is describe at a level that a computer could understand, which essentially means like very, very, very dumbed down and simplified and broken down to its most fundamental elements, like what a type would be, for like not in the sense that you would tell a computer what a type is, but that a computer could actually potentially detect types, learn about types, and do so on the basis of the actual data that's available in an organization. So when Spivak presents ologs, he talks about the problem of data siloing. Now, if you look at your typical website, you've got tons of information that's spread out, in text, in tables, in videos, in diagrams. But from a computational perspective, it's just raw data. It's very difficult to kind of like maneuver through it for a computer. And so, of course, humans are stuck kind of digging through tons of text, tons of tables, and it can be very time consuming, and it can also be incredibly error prone. So when Spivak and other folks were developing these technologies, they were kind of straddling a world of pure mathematics on the one hand, but also how do you bring together, in particular, if you've got a huge organization that's taking two different databases, often with different technologies, different categories or tables, different columns, and you have to bring them together, that can be a process that can take months, if not years. If it fails, you can be losing critical data, you can have systems crash. It's a very real problem. And I believe in a recent presentation, he quoted something like 40% of resources in certain cases for like IT could be spent in certain organizations on just basic data migration, data transformation questions. And so, this kind of started as a project, just kind of how do we kind of explore as computer nerds, like how do we explore the category theory. But as we got further into it, it quickly became apparent that what Spivak and co are working on, yet again, is super interesting from our commie perspective. And the kind of overall analogy I've been using to describe ourselves is, I think we're doing something very similar within social theory, to what physics often does, right? For the past few years, we've really been on the side of kind of theoretical physics, insofar as we have a whole number of domains that we're quite familiar with as social analysts, as activists, as political theorists. And we've been kind of just like rummaging through the world of pure mathematics in order to try to find the best formal tools to really model these problems that we're already quite familiar with. But now we're getting more and more interested in like what it actually means to test out these theories in practice, which of course, from a political perspective is always an interesting question. What does it mean to test a theory in practice? How do you actually construct a political experiment? It's not nearly so kind of cut and dry, and you can't really isolate variables in the same way you do in a physics experiment. And so the following part of the presentation in many ways is an attempt to get a sense of what do it mean to actually construct a laboratory, a practical organizational laboratory within which to test the ideas that our organization has been working on as STP. We've got all these cool mathematics, but we've also got, you know, everything that Dennis just went through, which, you know, for all the math that's here, the three main categories are our own, right? Composition, intelligibility, interaction. Like this is what kind of we're bringing to the table. And then what does it mean to actually test these things out? And so for a long time, coming from actually where I'm at now, Eugene, Oregon, from my earliest days as an activist here, I've been super interested in worker co-ops and kind of what role they have, given that I'm also pretty fond of, you know, Marxism, Leninist politics, things like that, which that side of the left has often been pretty critical, if not outright dismissive, of worker co-ops as either kind of utopian experiments at best or outright kind of like, you know, basically like crypto capitalist operations pretending to be for the workers when they're actually just lesser versions of a typical corporation. And you see a lot of critiques, for example, around one of the most famous examples, the Mondragon Corporation, which is highly problematic in a lot of ways. Only 1/3 of its workforce is actually like a member of the co-op per se. So there are real critiques about cooperatives that have been long-standing, but I think when we look at our basic thesis that like organizations sense things that individuals are quite literally incapable of sensing, right? Like we as embodied cognitive beings, we're not capable of sensing certain things that a collective can. And I think, you know, not just to, you know, to praise a comrade, but I think to really show what the organization itself is doing. Again, the fact that Dennis was just capable of condensing down all that stuff, I don't think that's just Dennis, right? Like that's our organization in a sense, like detecting a whole set of patterns that we've been working on collectively to try to reduce down to something. And I think that there is a way that this organization has really been detecting things on a very interesting level. And I'm sure anyone else that's been involved in at least the functional side of the left, wherever that is, has had that experience where there is something that you experience where you're clearly picking things up that you wouldn't have as an individual operator, as just like a lone social critic or whatever. It's often kind of the sense a lot of us get when we read someone as brilliant but also as pessimistic as Adorno, right? That there is as good as his critiques are, there's often this sense that like, of course you're going to reach that perspective of utter pessimism because you're writing from the perspective of an individual. And there's something that we need to kind of recover in the critical, but also constructive capacities of an organization that are really important, not just because we believe in collectives and groups and whatnot, but because literally we cannot test our ideas from the perspective of individuals. And of course, for a long time, the party, you know, I guess to a certain extent, the National Liberation Army or its various kind of children and grandchildren over the last century, have been the kind of privileged objects of such detection, right? And this isn't to say, oh, we should give up on those. I think that they certainly have their place and time. But I also think that there's something pretty fundamentally important about the co-op, because the co-op really gives us a way, I think, first and foremost, to address like a problem we keep coming up with as an organization. Like, how the hell do we as individuals in a group survive day to day while trying to do the good work, right? Like, how do we do that? And I think co-ops are a potential way to explore actually living in capitalism while working to transform or to revolutionize, whatever the case may be, the system, right? I think they're also, you know, going back to the classic notion of hegemony, which I really like. Of course, I'm going to go blank on his name right now, but it's a really good book called The Logic of Hegemony, and I'll find the link and send it out. But one of the main arguments that the author makes in that is that one of the key things Lenin takes seriously is how the Bolsheviks look to their enemies. Like, he uses the word optics a lot, which is kind of a buzzword nowadays. But the basic concept is, like, you can't truly develop a political calculus without really taking into account the perspectives of everyone, including your class enemies, and not just how they look at the world or themselves, but really how they see you. And similarly, Trotsky and a lot of his critiques of the Communist Party of Germany argued that one of their fundamental errors was to not take seriously enough how the middle class saw them, and whether or not the middle class had faith, or the petit bourgeois had faith in them to actually be able to lead feasibly, right? Could they keep the food coming, the water coming, the electricity? Could they keep society functioning in a day-to-day way? And I think the cooperative is a really important place to actually test and ultimately demonstrate the feasibility of socialist relations to those who are not already kind of ideologically bought in. And in the case of the middle classes, the professional classes, who are actually pretty materially invested, even if it's just like a little bit, in the capitalist system itself, right? And I think it's a very real way to get past a certain moralistic trap a lot of the left is in, which is like, well, if you don't agree, then you're not on our side anyway. Like, that's a dead end. And I think we all pretty much agree on that in this group. So, not to belabor the point. So this here is the product both of kind of a long trajectory of my own, and having spent time learning some, you know, operations management, just-in-time production stuff, and researching and getting hands involved in a lot of things on the ground, as well as like the last couple months of conversations with Dennis about like how we could actually take these ideas that he just presented in the kind of theoretical physicist side of my analogy and actually begin to construct the laboratory conditions for the experimental physics side. And I think we're there. And I think it's interesting because it seems like a lot of people are getting antsy for some organizing work. And so we're hoping that maybe this could be at least one avenue for that kind of thing. So I'd like to start. Why? Oh, what am I doing wrong now? Hold on a second. I gotta use this button. There we go. All right. All right. So this is actually a product of a conversation with Raphael, who was talking about with this, and kind of trying to look at the ways in which a co-op really seems to be a place where we can explore how the three modes tie together. Because on the one hand, a cooperative, if we look at the bottom right, it really has to be sensitive to and respond to the actual market conditions of capital, right? Any co-op has to actually be able to produce something that people will buy. And in order to do that, it has to detect demand, essentially. On the other hand, you know, the very political kind of basis and the thing that interests all of us is precisely that we could come together in that kind of idea of free association and build a cooperative that actually is shared by the workers. And a lot of my experience, especially I think of smaller cooperatives here in the States, you know, bakeries and restaurants and little niche things like that, is they've really been captured between modes A and mode C. It's a group of people that tend to come together. They often have overlapping skills or an overlapping vision, and they say, let's make this, and then let's count on kind of our commitment ethically, morally, to cooperativism, to free association, to make it work. And so you really have this kind of thing that happens where there's a reliance on mode A on the one hand and mode C on the other hand. And, you know, it has been by and large a failed experiment, right? There are quite a few co-ops in the United States. It's not by any means. In fact, I was doing some research last night. There are thousands of co-ops in the United States, but there are hundreds of thousands of businesses, and probably with the extension of micro enterprises, we might even be pushing millions soon. So it still is a tiny fraction of the total enterprise base. And then if you look at the actual revenue generated, it gets much, much, much smaller than the total revenue generated by all businesses in the United States. So And of course, we are like a huge economy here. So the fact that we've got co-ops isn't necessarily that impressive. And the fact that overall they're not growing is a very real problem. And so Rafael Sedania and I, being, adamant enemies of mode A in and of itself, and true believers in mode B, we're exploring the fact that in many ways the problem is that it's precisely the level of the protocol, the charter, the legal binding that has been the problem in a lot of these organizations. In other words, I think what has been an issue is these organizations haven't taken seriously that rather than trying to personalize everything and rely on mode A to supplement the problems of competition in mode C, what's often needed is actually precisely the same kind of legal binding that corporations themselves are bound to. And what do I mean by that? So, let's zoom back about a decade to like Occupy times. And I'm going to speak specifically here in the States. I can't say how this works elsewhere. But in the United States, of course, we have this thing called corporate personhood, which at this point is a 150-year-old legal precedent. And when a board of directors or the kind of executive suite, the main management leaders of a company make a decision, they're bound by the charter and by the fundamental founding documents of any given corporation, ultimately, which tend to come down to an obligation to produce profits and to return investments to shareholders. They can't break that. They are legally responsible. They will be held at least civilly accountable if they do break that. So, they can choose how to go about generating a profit, but they can't choose whether or not to generate a profit, or at least attempt to. In the same way, there's been a trend, and Dennis shared something called B corporations, which is an attempt to address this. And there are other models that are out there that utilize the existing kind of legal infrastructure of contracts, charters, and whatnot to do the exact same thing, but to bind people to some kind of, more progressive method. The B corporation uses a kind of stakeholder model that looks at everyone involved, workers, owners. It's not a cooperative model, but it does say, for example, a business in a community has to look at the community members, the environment, the consumers, the workers, as well as the investors and the executive management as stakeholders. And any of those stakeholders can hold the company legally responsible, not just like from the inside. They can't just kind of sue as like, oh, this company polluted the water and we got, cancer from it, and therefore we're going to sue. From the outside, as it were, for damages, you can actually say you're not living up to your own charter. And that gives a much greater degree of scope, not only to be able to hold these folks accountable, but to actually put pressure to steer the directions that these organizations can go in. So the problem here, though, I think, is that we don't really know what that looks like, right? Like capitalism had hundreds of years, if not like even longer in a certain sense. But certainly if we rewind to the Italian Renaissance, there was already centuries of kind of attempts at businesses, firms, corporations, joint stock companies before the critical 1870s court decisions that made in the United States corporate personhood an actual existing legal precedent that still exists today. And is, by the way, as much as people hate it, it's also why you can sue companies for damages. Without that, they would be completely unaccountable to the public. So it's a weird, I'm not against corporate personhood. What I'm against is that's all we've got to work with. But we don't really know what the proper protocols are to make a cooperative organization. And I think that that's where everything that Dennis just presented is going to be absolutely critical. Those are the, as it were, the scientific frameworks, the theoretical physics models we need to kind of give us an overall sense of what it would mean to build a corporation or to build a cooperative business. In other words, we have to understand from a kind of mode B protocol perspective, what is composition, what is interaction, and ultimately, because we have to be able to decide whether or not a company is living up to its expectations, how do we determine what is intelligible about a cooperative? So that's the kind of problem in terms of our modality theory. So here's the kind of proposal that I would like to put forward. It's still loose. I'm hoping to have a conversation with Giuliano soon, since he's our kind of resident NGO expert. But I do think for the time being, until I hear something different, that this idea has some has some legs. In other words, I'm interested in what it would be like to develop a non-governmental organization, NGO, that was a cooperative incubator that could work with potential cooperatives around the world. And in particular, I think, leverage things like dollar and euro imperialism to build co-ops here in the States and in Europe that could generate funds, and then also help finance projects in the global South and Brazil and elsewhere, utilizing differences of currency and financial power, et cetera, et cetera. But that would not be enough. So in other words, what are the kind of pieces that we need to get something like off the ground? And these are just a few things. We've got plenty of more room to grow, and anyone that wants to be involved in developing this more should definitely hit us up. The three things that I think like an incubator could do, and by an incubator, I mean a certain extension of what we're doing here in STP specifically towards this goal, would be things like market research and product development. So that's where olog really comes in, because olog does something that capitalism is constantly struggling to do. It makes visible the complexity of a system, and it makes it visible in a way that enables the different parts to interact together. I mean, this is a huge issue in any company. It's a constant conversation in tech. How do you get developers here and security folks there, and the people that keep the infrastructure running here to be able to interact with one another? How do you prioritize which of the many concerns that are out there should be put forward? If there's a conflict between the people that are writing the code and people that are testing the code, how do you determine which side should be listened to? A lot of times that comes down to the kind of arbitrary decisions of management, and sometimes that works, and then sometimes, as we've seen in the news recently, not so much. So I think the olog in general can give us a tool here. The olog can also be a basis for a critical piece of software called a customer relations management tool, which is something I built once. It's my really only thing I've built before for anything, but it was for a startup. And what a CRM system does is it essentially manages orders, both from customers as well as your own orders to get supplies for your production. So in our case, we were a nursery. We had to, provide so many seedlings to customers. And at the same time, we had to purchase fertilizers. We had to purchase, the equipment for the greenhouses, et cetera, et cetera. So what a CRM system does is it enables you to see that entire flow, and then to run various kind of algorithmic operations on it to optimize, to detect places that you've got choke points, to find places that you've got redundant labor, blah, blah, blah. And we can imagine the neoliberal period that this is generally used to lay people off and to turn up one person's job into wearing 3 or 4 hats at once. But from a cooperative perspective, this could actually be used to increase employment. You could hire more people by cutting the labor per person. You can make the positions more efficient, but by doing so, actually lower the labor load for any given person, and increase the competition of the company against capitalist enterprises. And all these tools always require training and consulting, and that's something that would definitely need to be done. On the other hand, we've got on the right side here, activist investing and cooperativization. And so here I just named a couple interesting things that I've found recently that I personally still have to do more deep dives on, but they're interesting. So the Mondragon is the famous Boss cooperative. And 10 years ago, they began a project with the United States Steel Workers Union to build what are called union co-ops, which is an interesting thing because the Mondragon itself, actually, the workers are not unionized, and that's a point of criticism. But here in the States, U.S. Steel Workers has been trying to buy out green industrial laundries in cities and turn them into cooperatives. And they're green, so they are supposed to be more environmentally friendly. And the idea is that because they have to be very local, you can't really ship your laundry elsewhere to another country to be done and then brought back. They're kind of somewhat resistant to the offshoring tendency of US capital. It's still an open experiment. Some of the shops have succeeded, some have failed. I'm trying to find more information, and as I do, I'll report back. But it is, if nothing else, an interesting experiment. Economic democracy advocates, it's something I literally just found out this morning, as I'm one of the groups I'm trying to promote this idea with here in Eugene. And they're a state level lobbying organization here in the United States, which I think is something very important. A lot of laws make it difficult for cooperatives to work. And I think if we have networks of people pushing legislation at the municipal, state, and federal level in the United States and build up a kind of support around this. This is where we get into kind of more classic, quote, Leninist style organizing, where we're really putting pressure on the powers that be and stuff like that. But there's some interesting things there about like, what does it mean to like kind of push at the civil society level and the legal level to make more space for cooperatives? And then finally, I'm started to explore a variety of hybrid investment models. So the top group there, Rewild Organics, is an actual cooperative. They purchase land in Costa Rica that's been denuded by, clear-cut deforestation down there. As much as they can, they try to purchase it cooperatively with indigenous groups, if not with other kind of poor people around. And what they do is they focus on a few really high demand kind of like health food things. Jackfruit, turmeric is actually their #1 product, and they're really freaking good at it. And it's the kind of thing that's got a really high markup that, hippies up here in the States love and are willing to pay god awful amounts of money for. And then that kind of like feeds back into a farming process that's owned by, otherwise disenfranchised and landless people in Costa Rica. And there's similar projects for like tea in Tibet and things like that have been developed, where you've got these kind of partnerships between American distributors and kind of imperial oppressed economically like kind of peripheral nations in order to try to get this kind of virtuous cycle. I've already mentioned the P Corps, which is a good thing. And then finally, these special purpose acquisition companies, or SPACs, which couldn't be more like neoliberal financial capital. They're all about kind of making money quick for initial public offerings for big tech companies and things like that. But what's really interesting about them is the basic way they work is you're allowed to keep a lot of secrets, because when a company's going public, they don't want to reveal too much to their competition before they're fully public. The timing of IPOs is really important, blah, blah, blah. And so one of the things that's interesting about SPACs is you can raise money without actually having a fully worked out investment plan yet. That's what makes them kind of sketchy, like really sketchy. There was a huge bubble burst a year ago with them. But I think they could potentially be tooled to where we could raise money around, for example, and I'll get into this let's say we wanted to buy out a restaurant that was about to go under. The workers want to own it, but they don't have the capital. Their boss is not a good leftist, like he just wants his money and he'll sell to whoever, right? You could potentially raise money with a SPAC while you're still looking for the perfect restaurant that kind of fits the bill. Like I've worked in that industry more than anything else. I know these restaurants all over the place, but that doesn't necessarily mean I know right now which restaurant is the best fit. You could be raising money, using that money to do the research and development to find the perfect business. And then when you do, you've already got the funds together. So there are a number of interesting kind of tools that are already out there that we can leverage from capitalism, as well as other progressive experiments like B Corps, union co-ops, this economic democracy advocates that we can potentially partner with in this idea of ecology, right? Where we're not necessarily trying to do everything ourselves, but find our niche in a larger ecosystem. So that's all good and well, but what actually could we do as co-ops? Like, we got to still have a product. So here are some of the ideas that have come up for myself and others, and I'll just run through them quickly. I think a lot of this stuff we can dig through in detail in conversation, but I just wanted to go through. One thing I haven't done, I'll point out, though, is Mondragon is a huge industrial co-op. They make like dishwashers and microwaves and stuff. And honestly, I don't necessarily think that's the best way to go. And Mondragon's got a very particular history that has to do with Franco and the Basque region and blah, blah, blah. But I think for what we're looking at, there's a lot of other areas that make more sense. So I already mentioned, we'll just go left to right. The service sector, restaurants are a big one. Food production, like bakeries and things, as well as therapeutics. I mean, I live in Eugene. It's full of massage therapists and acupuncturists and herbalists, love non-traditional medicine. People that, when they work individually, it's really hard to make a profit a lot of times. It's really hard to make a living. But there are a lot of potential ways that you can kind of bring, and that tends to be the case in a lot of massage clinics and stuff. They kind of like partner together. But I think we kind of take it to the next step potentially. And similarly with things like art co-ops, right? Like a major issue I've known with a lot of my artist friends that sell their art is, you know, they may need one tool for like 5-10% of the work, but that tool costs a ton of money, right? And it often requires maintenance. So how do you kind of bring these things together where you could have a group of artists collaborating? There's a lot of stuff in that area. In tech, you know, Dennis and I are looking at implementing olog as a piece of software. Unfortunately, we found out Spivak's already done it, and I highly doubt we're going to do it as well as him and his MIT crew, but there's definitely still space to grow. And there's a lot of different ways we can implement olog. They're doing one way. We think we can find some other niches. So there's definitely, like, it's not a dead end. It's just we're still revising the concept. But here I put down the canonical model. And Canonical is the company that runs Ubuntu Linux. Like they own it and manage it. And, you know, Ubuntu is free. The educational resources are free, blah, blah, blah. But when a company uses Ubuntu servers and runs millions of dollars of business through it, they retain Canonical to do trainings, to do tech support, to customize and configure the software for their specific needs. And we think there's a niche that, like, we could be making money with olog, which could really work as a pipeline in automation and data analysis and data engineering. You know, we could offer it as an open source tool, which, by the way, Spivak is not doing. Theirs is a closed source tool. So that's one thing we can really lean into. But if a big company picks us up, then we could begin to charge for, you know, again, the configuration, the support, and the training. There's also been a big move towards like freelancer groups. There's a lot of kind of like workspace stuff like up in Portland, but there's still kind of essentially capitalist enterprises where it's built on kind of a shareholder model. And there's probably similarly with like the idea of like the massage clinics that are out there, even though there's a kind of small step towards cooperativization with these freelancer groups, there might be ways to push it even further. There's some interesting stuff that's out there on that direction. The education stuff is actually, this is all Rafael Sedana's idea. Hopefully he can bring up some of his ideas in the discussion, but there's a lot of space for developing schools, developing frameworks for education, as well as offering independent classes. Being something of a dirty hippie at heart, you know, I've spent a lot of time in urban farming, micro farming operations, setting up things from scratch, recovering pretty unhealthy soil and turning it over and making it viable, getting compost going. And there's a lot there, whether we're talking about the production of food, processing goods, you know, dried fruit, fermented stuff, medicinal herbs and the various processing there, tinctures, as well as like supplementary things. And by supplements, I don't mean nutritional supplements. I mean things like compost tea, mulching, things like that, which, I mean, I was just talking to a friend of mine in Missoula. There's a group there that sells worm case soil for $25 a pound, and people are buying it. So there's a lot of money to be made there if you do the right product. And then finally, like my kind of pet project within a pet project that is ultimately where I'd love to go is a cooperative disaster relief thing, because I think that that's where you can really start nerding out on like communization, right? When Katrina hit New Orleans 17 years ago, whatever, 2005, I believe it was, you know, you had what you often see in kind of disaster scenarios. People come together and they start supporting each other. And then immediately after, the New Orleans police came through and broke up camps, right? People were dispersed in the middle of a massive flood disaster. And this is a typical thing that you see, at least here in the States, with disasters. And I think that there's a lot of space. There's also a huge private industry in disaster relief that's funded by the government and by United Nations and whatnot. So there's a lot of work that could be done where you're helping, you know, getting people boots on the ground, which is something, especially for young activists, a lot of people want to do this kind of stuff, where you could help rebuild things in a much more kind of technologically, ecologically sound way. And you could be providing security for people as you're doing so. I think in many ways, that's like one of the long shot things, even though it's a dear dream of mine. The other things are probably closer to hand, but we're also, of course, on an unprecedented level of climate disaster. So it's definitely not out of the ballpark either. So I think, when we kind of look at these three areas, the way that our theory of modes kind of gives us a way to think about the co-ops as being tied together, that there's a space organizationally for something like an incubator that could be a very kind of like direct experimental extension of STP. And that there's a ton of different things on the ground that people are already doing. I mean, especially with COVID, there's been an explosion in micro enterprise. My friend that I just was living with started a bakery because of many, like it had started before COVID, but it exploded because of deliveries and stuff during COVID. And there's been a ton of micro enterprises taken off. But with the return to things as normal, a lot of those micro enterprises are now starting to hit, the typical problems of competition with capitalist enterprise. So a lot of people are looking for ways to keep their relative independence, to be able to provide. I mean, like my friend Lotus's goods are like incredibly, not only they're really good, I mean, they're really good at what they do, but they're also dietary wise very sensitive to the various allergies people have and things like that. Like there's a lot of good people trying to use business as a way to push progressive ideas. And it's so easy, I think, for us on the left to dismiss that sentiment. But at least here in the United States, that's often really the only option people have, right? You can't really go, even if you want to join a union and organize that, you're still bound a lot of times by like, you don't as a union often get to say what you're selling or what you're doing. You just get to have some influence on the conditions under which you do that. So the cooperative does give us a space to experiment with things in a way that is, I think, pretty unprecedented. But at the same time, I think our theory from STP gives us a way to approach it that is unprecedented for cooperatives. And so I think we are at a very interesting juncture right now where we have an opportunity to offer something that no one else is really offering here, and yet that is in demand around the world, and that is kind of rising to the surface in many ways. So this is something I know that several people in this group are interested in, and I know that I'll personally continue to be pursuing it here locally and elsewhere. I've been setting up meetings with other folks that are interested in this stuff around Oregon. And so this is going to be happening in one form or another, but I do hope that we can kind of, as an organization, develop some kind of perspective on this and kind of really take the opportunity to find a way to create these laboratory conditions, in my analogy here with physicists, to really begin to test our ideas out in practice. So yeah, I mean, there's obviously a lot here. I'm happy to dive into these details in conversation, but I also think it'd be good to turn over at this point to the larger conversation, and we can just kind of like, figure it out in discussion. So I'm just going to leave it there. And let's do the thing. Thank you.
Thanks, John. I had a question, which is like, how do you envision STP's role in this? Like, I agree with you. I think our theory has a lot of like applications here. Just the terminology or the kind of way that we perceive or have been trying to model organizations, but in like day-to-day business decisions, or how the co-op structures itself, how it makes decisions itself, how does STP fit into that?
I don't know. Like, I'm not even like, I to a certain extent, I've kind of not gone down there because I don't know, I mean, I've got this, this NGO idea we've been talking about and whatnot. And I suppose that's an open question to the degree to which this group wants to dive in on that, if that's even like the best way to approach it. But yeah, I haven't really wanted to like go too far down that imaginary path, because I kind of wanted to test the grounds. But I mean, I guess really, I mean, yeah, I mean, I guess that NGO idea is kind of where I'm at imaginatively with what I would see STP doing.
Yeah. Well, yeah, it's definitely, I mean, it's a really interesting idea there, because like in the case of like theoretical, to use the physics thing, you have like theoretical stuff, and then you have the laboratory creates an experiment, and then that experimental data has to like interact with the theory in some way, either modifying the theory or confirming the theory. And I think there's something there that I think STP could do as far as like making itself amenable to taking in the experience of the co-op, like maybe just simply like inviting people who run co-ops to speak on their experience and seeing like, is that, you know, is that fitting what we're like, are there new things there that we haven't really thought about?
Yeah, I mean, you know, one thing I'd be curious about, because I think that to a certain extent, I'm in part of the many inspirations. One of those is the CSII experience, right? Which of course I'm very distant from, and you know, I've only know through basically like some of the stories here and the texts that have been published. But you know, that seemed like a really fascinating experiment in kind of like deliberately treating the left as an ecology rather than as like a tip, you know, like trying to treat where you're interacting instead of like trying to dominate or hegemonize the space. And I feel that, yeah, I mean, we have to approach it similarly, like inviting other people with experience, trying to do a survey of what's already out there so we're not being too redundant, but also maintaining a certain degree of autonomy so we don't kind of lose ourselves in other perspectives and other things. Because a lot of, like I said, a lot of the ways that co-ops have been done, I do think are theoretically and practically problematic. And I do think we have something new to offer. And I do think we want to maintain the degree of autonomy that enables us to bring that without, again, trying to have the like, we're the one and true way of the left mentality, which we don't do here. But I think that's, you know, something we'd continue in that vein. Anna?
Hi, I just want to say this is an awesome presentation. It's really cool to see some aspects of STP's framework being connected on this level to like practical organizing stuff. I share a lot of your same intuitions, I think, about ways that it can be applied, and like the kinds of projects that you're going over, I think are really great ideas. Of course, you know, the devil is going to be in the details, and like to see if this kind of thing is even feasible for SCP to engage in. But yeah, I'd love to be able to help with something like that. One point though I wanted to bring up is because I've also been thinking about it a lot lately after like trying to pick apart and understand that Aurora Apolito piece about the scale problem and anarchism and cybernetic communism and all of that. I got really interested in following up a little bit more on this idea of integrated informational complexity as like an alternative to market systems. And I know that STP did, like, you know, there was that presentation on integrated information theory and like a little bit of related stuff with like extended mind. But I'm curious about like in connection with all of this stuff, has there been any more follow-up on like ways of conceiving of integrated informational complexity? Is that something that, you know, there are any routes of like connecting that to the category theory frameworks? Like, is that something that you know, has kind of been left behind, or is there still you know, some attempt to, or like some ideas maybe you have about connecting it to some of what's going on here?
Explicitly, no, we haven't taken that on, and I definitely think I'm still not super familiar with that stuff myself, but I from what I've heard in these meetings, I think there's probably a lot of space for that. That being said, I suspect that that's one of those places where olog really does come in because of the role that, you know, I mean, Dennis and I are still trying to work through the whole like systems, information system, fusion system part of olog, which is really where it all gets interesting. But I also think that's precisely where what you're talking about would come in, where we'd be able to go beyond kind of like using things like integrated information systems to describe an alternative to markets, to actually be able to use them as alternative to markets. But you know, that's just speculation and conjecture on my part, and we would definitely need to do the research to go further in that. And of course, if that's something you're interested in, we'd also gladly welcome your participation to the degree that you'd be interested.
Yeah, that's great to hear. I was thinking that too with the ologs, like even just from this basic introduction, it seems like, especially if you're talking about them in terms of databases, I'm sure there are all sorts of interesting ways potentially to connect it to work that's being done in information theory and especially with integrated information. So it'd be cool to see more follow-ups with that.
Yeah, on that point also, like, yeah, the Apple's text is really important. I think, I mean, we should always revisit it because it's so like it has so many connections to what we think about here. And she makes this distinction between like she talks about like these tools of connectivity, right? I think olog fits into that really well.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's all I had to add. But just, yeah, I think like when we're talking about building tools or building infrastructure for organizations, I think we should refer back to that text.
What is the title again of it?
I'll drop the PDF in the chat.
Cool, thank you. I feel like I missed that meeting or something. I've only ever heard it referenced, never. But yeah.
Oh, I think you'll love it.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. It's fascinating too because I shared that YouTube of Spivak and that literally came out today. So there's something that just feels very timely about what we're doing, and you know, I do think there's always something in politics where like you can do all the prep and all the thinking you want, but there's also timing and rhythm and just like making the jump at the right time. And I'm not saying this is the ultimate thing to do that, but I do feel like, you know, doing something is kind of where we're at. And you know, oh man, yeah, that does look cool just from the description. Sweet. So I got that. I'll check that out, and yeah, I'll get back to you about that. And I'm curious too. I mean, like the more I learn about Brazilian politics, the more I realize what an interesting space of experimentation, for better and for worse, because both the left and the right are quite innovative down there. And I am curious if you know, not necessarily in the meeting if people don't know off the top of their heads, but just going forward, if there are kind of cooperative experiments along these lines, both that we can learn from, but also potentially interface with in Brazil. And also Renzo's in Italy. I know there's a ton of stuff cooperatively there over time. So there might be, you know, interesting things as far as like asking people to speak or studying things or doing presentations or doing our own kind of like analyses of existing events that are out there.
I just want to say something. I think this is I'm still having to digest everything because I think in a sense it seemed like two presentations at the same time, and actually it literally was, but it was interesting having both of them because in a sense you can see more clearly how there's a relation between like theoretical STP and applied STP. I mean, this doesn't seem like so much of a fantasy. But you were saying, John, about these perspectives, and this is actually a discussion that me and Renzo are currently postponing, but he'll be in Rio, so I think we'll be able to get to talk about that in the near future. But I actually do, this is like something we also talked about last week, but I actually do think that schools, they are a prime testing ground for STP ideas, especially due to the fact that in a sense, I think they like condense in a miniature version many possible sites of experiments. I mean, you can try out many different types of problems because at least in Brazil, schools are also like one of the most sensible social spaces that we have. It's like the only place we have that it's going to be like it's the only type of service that we have that reaches most of the population. So this is something that really excites me. and this is like something that I think I'm sure to develop, like, I mean, to get back with the NGO incubator in mind, because just so people can like have a like just a glimpse of what he was mentioning, because I think it adds a bit to the discussion into some of the problems. There's this like a really weird moment we are going on in Brazil right now, and it's going to be, it's not going to end with Lula, because it was actually his education team that started this thing, which is we are getting sort of we are having sort of a, how do you say, a startup. I mean, it's like it's a startup culture in the schools, in a sense, not like in the sense that there will be tech guys solving problems, but because, for example, we are having this this change where the big businesses in the education world, and there is a big business here because there is an exam to get into the public universities, and that really drives like 99% of what education, basic education, is about, like from primary school to high school. It's all directed at letting people pass this exam, because there's a real big social gain when you can go to the public university. So what's been happening in the last few years, and this is like an adaptation of educational policies in the US, like standardization, culture of bonuses, etc. And what I think that really relates to what John has been presenting, and it's actually related to, well, this is a recorded meeting, so I won't say so much, but there's this there's these big corporations that they are seeing that it's more easy to gain wealth, not by creating schools, buying schools, but by selling educational frameworks, where you have like a support system, you have a material that will be taught. Teachers don't have to be learned on the curriculum. I mean, and for example, in the area of philosophy, it's something that's happens a lot, because most teachers who teach philosophy classes are history teachers, so they don't have to have any formation. But it's a market opportunity that's been growing. It's like a multi-billion-dollar industry, like literally. And but at public schools, which is like where most of education is done in Brazil, they have been recently some of them have started to receive, because of privatization, they have become, how should I say, they have been open to adopting these frameworks. So there's like an intense destruction of public education in Brazil, and private also, because the autonomy of the teacher is all going down the drain, etc., etc. But what I think is like interesting for us, at least, and this is why I'm making this overextended footnote. I'm sorry for interrupting. I think this is something that I was very excited after talking to John. But I do think that this co-op incubator model and all these different aspects, like that there was in the graph, the market strategy, I forgot I forgot the name of the other two, but I think there's like a program of what would be a framework, an educational framework to, in a sense, participate in the system of selling frameworks that would, in a sense, disseminate things that might be more interesting for us. Mm-hmm. And I think there's like a lot of things to deal with before we even get to get down on this in a more practical sense. But I'm very excited about this perspective, because I do think that school ground is a very hot experimental ground, as like I think Renzo's presentation on school occupations made that clear. This is not like a dead place. Like this is like actually somewhere very active. And I do wonder if there are certain educational frameworks that we could construct, and it would have to be some open source framework. I mean, this is something we'd have to work out. What would that mean exactly? But I've been thinking that it might be interesting to, as a point, to test out these ideas. But I mean, that's something I was thinking as you were presenting.
Thank you, Raphael. Yeah, I mean, I think that's super interesting on so many levels. I mean, I'll come back to the frameworks in general, but I do think, like, I mean, obviously there's some differences between the school systems in Brazil and the United States on quite a few levels, but the school systems have been so deeply, if not themselves directly privatized, everything around them, right? From food to textbooks to, yeah, trainings of teachers and supplementary classes to the technical services for Zoom and IT and blah, 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 that it could really get us into important places and get us, you know, to students, get us to people that would be directly kind of like interfacing and getting services from co-ops. And I think that could have huge benefits. It's super interesting, I think, because it's also one of those places that would require what I was talking about in terms of like a kind of political supplement, because getting into the school world is a political thing, right? Like, and especially like it seems as much in Brazil as in the United States, you know, so much has been politicized about schools that I can only imagine here in the US if like a commie co-op was selling frameworks, what Fox News and the GOP would say. But at the same time, here, you know, some of the most militant people for trans rights are on school boards right now. Some of the most militant people for, you know, Black Lives Matter are in schools right now. So yeah, I think you're spot on, and I'm really excited to explore that. I also want to say in general, you know, I'm a very noob to the world of IT, and my particular area I'm getting into cybersecurity, but the whole IT world is full of frameworks, and frameworks that are offered by government organizations, by nonprofits, and by private companies. And a lot of them are competing, a lot of them are redundant, and a lot of them are, you know, not necessarily super interesting. So I think in general, especially given how many of us are theorists and have that kind of like high order perspective, I think the framework question in general has a lot of potential and is worth exploring, up to and including like consulting issues. Because a lot of times, you know, even if, you know, like you could get paid to consult, you could go in there and offer a lot of good left-wing advice and they don't take any of it, you still get paid to consult, you know? And a lot of times a company will be more productive if it treats its workers better, you know? So you can go in there and give some pretty left-wing advice and still increase the competition, you know, competitiveness of a company. So yeah, I think there's a lot to explore there, and a lot of areas that are kind of gray or not quite so traditionally radical, but are actually potentially quite productive from our perspective. Renzo, I saw you had your hand and dropped it, but I wanted to make sure that you weren't getting passed.
Yeah, I'm not sure where to start from. I mean, I think it's really cool to have this conversation, to start this conversation, and I think I share a lot of the excitement that I was talking about in terms of like thinking what kinds of sectors are. In a sense, it's like it's a matter of like what are the most strategic or more interesting sectors to think about, like to use as the most promising like test ground for what we're talking about. And I think, and I think it's a relevant question because for example, like the cooperatives in say like delivery work, I think it's a very different like political thing than what a cooperative of schools are. Like and from what a cooperative of like some like producing some goods. So for example, like in the cooperatives in delivery work, I think they're not, I mean, one would have to be convince me that that's sort of like some work that we really want to maybe keep on like another world. Like it's, I feel like education still has this sort of like generic property, right? It's something that we something about education we want to preserve and reorganize in such a way that it has other capacities. So education has this sort of like transitive property of being also present in other societies, while delivery work, I think, for example, how cooperatives emerges, they could, the way we only have basically really, I mean, in my experience, like in Brazil, like they're normally like an initiative for like more militant, for example, they're like trans cooperatives, like anarchist cooperatives, and they're already a bit niche. So they sort of seem to be more like serving the function of like mode A, of sort of like building a community for some organization. While you could, for example, say that it could actually play the role of in a movement, sort of like workers having to work a bit less. So it's not necessarily like an alternative economic system, it's more a way of like decreasing, making work a bit more tolerable and having more time to do like to do political activity and other stuff. So I think it's also relevant to be sensitive on what, and I think that the distinction that I presented on like the whether it's internal or like the surface, I think that's where like there's a lot of work to be done, which is like trying to distinguish which aspects of a cooperative or of some system of cooperatives are doing like interface work, or sort of like creating sort of like membrane that has to interact with the market, and how this constraints from the outside, from the market, constraints internally, like the internal logic. So the more a system can dissociate itself from those pressures and those constraints, I think the more space. So how, I think the question of how you create this sort of like internal substrate and internal logic is very relevant. So that's why I think sectors like education, housing, and food are like more strategic, because they're already sort of like reorganizing a substrate that is relevant for to build another social like reproduction system. And so I think we're building many tools that are like will be useful to make all these distinctions possible, right? And yeah, so there's that. And yeah, on the education, and I think on the other thing on education is also the fact that it's, yeah, like for many reasons, like you're from the point of view of like militant formation, right? You're dealing with young people, so it's already something that carries a lot of potential for, and then there's the fact that it's a service. So I think it's less subject to sort of like productivity pressures, because it's not as malleable to like rapid productivity increases, like sort of like producing like food, in which you're constrained in a much stronger way. So it's this sort of like constant commodity, and it's, yeah, I don't know, I'm just rambling a bit, but
No, I think you're spot on with that. Absolutely.
yeah. And there's another point, I think something that Rafael made it once about, I feel a bit like universities are sort of this ideological model of what political work can be, and while school has this, it's a bit like the Sergio Ferro's opposition. I think that was Rafael's point on the difference between architecture and art. While art is, I don't remember if, I mean, Rafael, correct me if the argument is like this, but art functions a bit as the sort of like artificial space where like free work can be sort of enacted, where architecture, you're actually dealing with a sort of like real social reorganization of the social sphere. And I feel a bit like universities, I mean, at least in Brazil, they function a lot of the sort of like place where people enact their political sort of desires through like other means or through like debate and whatnot. And for a long time, it has been this sort of like horizon of like public education and so on, while you get a lot of more of the, like the real social constraint. I mean, it is true that, I mean, that's not full picture, of course, but I think the constraints on like how private education, and I mean, that's also true for a private university, but yeah, I mean, there's less, I think, space for utopian thinking and in like the school sector than university. And so I think that's also like, yeah, again, I don't think that's, we should just focus on schools. I think there are other sectors like IT and I mean, whatever we can get, I think at this point, whatever we can get get to interact with is useful and it's great. Like, I think we should actually focus on like more concretely on getting to interact with these initiatives and thinking about like the problems of, and sorry for going on so long, but another point I wanted to make is that I think the problem of connecting, and I think you sort of like hinted at that, connecting cooperatives is probably like one of the greatest challenges, right? It's finding the kind of the, and I'm not sure if it's completely like mode B, but it's certainly like some sort of like commune in which you have to integrate a sort of like common protocol of, but I think it's also like about mode D, what's like a mode C, interior space that connects different cooperatives that is not a market, right? So I think the space of connecting cooperatives is also something that we could work on, like, because I think that's, I mean, I think it's all super cool to have like a cooperative school and to see my friends work on that. But once you start thinking, what if there was like another school cooperative in another city, then the problem of how you produce like exchanges between them that are not like via the market or via like the state, then it's really, it poses like lots of new problems that I think is also, I don't think there's that much, I'm not familiar, but I'm not sure there's that much
There isn't.
Thinking about it.
Those are great points.
Yeah.
I'm gonna focus on 1 and 3 just because the school stuff is not quite my specialty. Those are really good points, and I think Raphael in particular is I can see the wheels turning in chat. But yeah, I mean, I just shared an article, I think it was 2015, a critique of the Mondragon cooperatives from a labor perspective by someone who actually did like ethnographic studies there on the ground and other places. And I think that that's one of those, you know, when you're talking about the kind of relationship, the dialectic between the internal and the surface, you know, it really gets into that. I mean, this is one of the leading kind of paradigms of the cooperative, and yet as a whole, the Mondragon owns a bunch of businesses, half of which are not cooperative, and it employs tons of people, only a third of which are members. And it actually relies heavily on highly exploited labor in China and Poland and elsewhere in order to maintain the quality of life and that space that you're talking about of the members within Mondragon. So it's had to rely on neoliberal style profitability strategies in order to maintain a certain quality of life, which, you know, reminds me of a small version of like the quality of life benefits for white workers in the United States, right? Like, which is often built on, is fundamentally built on, you know, the hyper exploitation of workers, both domestically and of course within the global South. So yes, we absolutely have to frame the problem like you did between like the interface of the surface and the internal. And when, you know, Anna correctly said that the devil's in the details, that's where I think the details really do come out. On the connecting co-ops thing, yeah, absolutely, there's still a lot of work to be done there. And I think there's a lot of thinking that we offer as STP. And I also think that, you know, maybe it's just because I love that old Russian dude, but like, I feel like this is one of the places where, like, you know, the kind of quote Leninist way of thinking can kind of be retooled, because, you know, he was so good, as he put it, like finding that essential link, like what exactly, how do we kind of advance the struggle one step at a time by picking just the right step to advance. And yeah, I think a lot of times, you know, that's less about starting a co-op and more about like, how do we kind of support what's already happening? So tomorrow morning, I'm having a conversation with an old activist friend of mine that lives elsewhere in Oregon, who works at a kind of a whole, you know, like a small health food grocery store that's looking to cooperativize, right? You know, I don't know if that becomes a priority, but it's just an indicator that this is already happening, right? And just like there were tons of different struggles happening in Tsarist Russia, right? And sometimes it wasn't always the worker struggle. Sometimes it was religious minorities or ethno-national minorities or women's rights or even international solidarity with other struggles, right? Like, I think we really have to be open to that kind of like classic Marxist political analysis of like, what is it that we need to be doing right now? What are the main kind of essential links that we really need to be building, or conversely pushing on? You know, where are the places in capitalism, the contradictions, right? Like, you know, this idea of frameworks that Raphael is bringing up in education, you know, that is such a huge multi-billion-dollar capitalist initiative in Brazil and elsewhere that's happening here in the States and many other places. But precisely because the schools have become ground zero, both for like kind of capitalist exploitation and ideological struggle, that means there are opportunities for us there, right? And defining those opportunities, getting a sense of their kind of topology, and then making the most of them, that is, you know, where like we can leverage the details to ourselves, right? Like the devil's in the details for the capitalists as well. And as the crisis continues, it doesn't make it all rosy. It's not like this is going to just automatically pop up, but it does give us opportunities. And I think that kind of rethinking a lot of the classic quote Leninist perspective, not from the party form, but from the co-op form, at least for me, like it's been a kind of fruitful thought experiment to kind of work through what that would look like. But yeah, I mean, you just brought up three huge real world problems there, Renzo, that require a lot of working through, and are very much all on point. So I know it's like 8:30, right, in Rio, and what is it, midnight 30 for you, Renzo? And we did, you know, we're only 2.5 hours in, but at the same time, we did do a kind of 1-2 punch from abstract mathematics and computer science to like, yeah, only like we've been so we're so used to. It's only 2.5 hours. But we did kind of like cover quite a bit of terrain, so I think maybe the cognitive cost is a little higher qualitatively this time. So I just wanted to check in. I think maybe this is a good wrap-up point. But you know, I don't want to like if there's anything out there. But I'm really appreciate you guys. I might be getting a job soon, and I might not be able to attend these meetings much longer. We'll see. So I kind of took this empty meeting with Dennis to kind of just toss this out there. We've been wanting to share this with the group, so it didn't just kind of like float off on its own little thing. I'm very excited to hear your thoughts. I'm really glad that it's resonated with some people, and it really feels I don't know, I'm just really stoked that like this is at least resonating at the moment. But yeah, I just really appreciate y'all like taking this so thoughtfully today. Are there any final thoughts, Dennis or anyone else? Yeah, and totally, yeah. 9 p.m. Pacific Standard Time, 9 a.m. Pacific Standard Time, 11 a.m. Central Time. So that would be 2 p.m. Rio and 6 p.m. right, Italy. Yeah, our first real endeavor is we're gonna make our own cryptocurrency. That'll be the real thing. Commie coin. Buy low, sell high, man. Well, I hear a resounding. I figure whenever the chat turns to jokes, that's one of our signs that the meeting is wrapping up. Renzo, there's a chance I might be hitting you up for technical issues if I struggle with YouTube again, but I'll if that's an issue, I'll hit you up tomorrow so that you're not waiting up. But I should be able to
Oh,
log
yeah,
in
for
because I've
sure.
already had the 2FA, right?
Sorry?
As far as loading this up to YouTube, last time I had to go through you for the 2-factor authentication, but I think I should be able to do so from my
Yeah,
computer.
if you have problems, you can just, yeah, hit me up.
Okay. Word. Well, so this should be up later today, if not tomorrow, if I have technical difficulties. Yeah. Thank you, everyone. This was great. Really appreciate your
Thanks,
time.
everyone. Take care.
Yeah, it was really awesome. Thanks, guys.
Bye.